A single sentence captures the immense, almost omniscient power these women held. A 1950s telephone operator was the search engine, the group chat, and the gossip column for an entire town, all at once.
It's a striking image, isn't it? We often picture them just plugging cords, but they sat at the absolute nexus of all information, quietly absorbing every affair, every debt, every breakup, even casserole recipes within a 40-mile radius.
And they were sworn to absolute secrecy, paid almost nothing for this extraordinary privilege, which seems like an incredible contradiction. How did someone even end up in that chair? Nobody dreams of connecting calls for a living.
You're right, it wasn't a childhood ambition for most. The path there was often less about genuine choice and more about circumstance, coupled with a very specific set of requirements. We're talking about young women, typically between 17 and 25, unmarried, with neat hair and a clear speaking voice. These weren't just preferences, they were non-negotiable job requirements before you ever said a word to anyone at the company.
So it was less about your skills and more about your persona, almost. Your very being was under scrutiny.
Precisely. Perhaps your mother had worked the boards before you, or maybe the local factory wasn't hiring that month, but the telephone company almost always seemed to be. You'd walk into a brick building downtown, sit through an interview where your diction, your accent, and your overall tone of voice mattered far more than any resume you might have presented. They weren't listening to your answers as much as they were listening to how you sounded, how you presented yourself verbally.
And what exactly were they listening for? What was the ideal voice of the community, according to the phone company?
A pleasant, neutral voice was key. It had to be clear, carry warmth, and critically, it couldn't have too thick a regional twang. Think of it like an audition for a singing competition where the only song you're allowed to perform is the word hello. A harsh or nasal tone could end the interview on the spot before you even had a chance to elaborate on your qualifications. It's fascinating how much emphasis was placed on this singular attribute, given the incredible complexity of the job itself.
That's a huge filter to pass through. But it wasn't just your voice, was it? There was also a physical inspection, which feels particularly invasive by today's standards.
Absolutely. After the vocal audition came the equally judgmental physical assessment. Your posture was scrutinized, the condition of your hands, your overall grooming, and a general air of respectability. The company wanted a very specific kind of young woman. Tidy, polite, dependable, and above all, someone highly unlikely to cause a scandal. You were representing the company to the entire town, even if no one would ever actually see your face or the meticulous uniform you wore.
So they were essentially curating an image, even though the public-facing aspect was entirely auditory. It feels almost like judging livestock at a county fair, as this account puts it, but the prize was a headset and a wooden chair, and your personal background factored into this heavily as well.
It did, in ways that now feel deeply unfair. Unmarried women were strongly preferred, largely because a married woman might eventually leave to raise children, creating turnover and necessitating new training. Companies also often had preferences for a particular look or a specific family reputation. In many towns, this meant the operators came from a very narrow segment of the community. You weren't just applying for a job, you were applying to become the acceptable voice of an entire town. This wasn't about merit in the way we understand it today. It was about conformity in a very specific brand of public reliability.
That's a profound observation. It suggests the role wasn't just a job, but almost an identity imposed upon them. What happened once you were hired? Were you just thrown onto the switchboard, given a quick rundown?
Far from it. Once hired, you weren't immediately let loose on the demanding machinery. You entered a rigorous training program. The chords, the lights, the precise scripts, the rigid etiquette of the work, all of it had to be mastered. You'd practice company phrases until they were carved into your tongue, becoming second nature. This training involved learning to sit upright for hours without straining and to maintain that sweet, even tone under immense pressure. Older, seasoned operators would watch you, correct you, and at times genuinely terrify you with their strictness.
It sounds less like job training and more like indoctrination. A strict, soft-spoken convent that happened to run on electricity is a remarkably vivid description. What was the compensation for all this stringent vetting and demanding training?
The pay was, in a word, modest. However, the prestige associated with the role was surprisingly high. Being a telephone operator was considered clean, respectable work, a significant step up from, say, factory labor for many women. Families were proud to say their daughter worked the boards. Neighbors often treated you with a certain deference, understanding you held a crucial position of trust within the community. So while the paycheck was stubbornly thin, there was a definite social currency to the role that served as a different kind of compensation.
That's a fascinating trade-off. High prestige, low pay. It almost suggests the social status was part of the compensation package, designed to make the low wages more palatable, more enduring. So you're hired, you're trained, you dress the part, and you sound perfect. Then you meet the machine itself. How intimidating was that initial encounter with the switchboard?
The switchboard was truly a beast. Imagine walking into a dimly lit room to find a towering wooden wall, absolutely riddled with holes and lights. It's described in the account as hungry. Hundreds of small holes, each one a direct doorway into someone's home or business. Below these, dozens of cords, tipped with brass plugs, coiled like sleeping snakes, just waiting to be yanked into action at a moment's notice.
A wall of holes and lights sounds almost organic, like a living entity demanding constant attention.
Exactly, and it was. The moment someone lifted a receiver anywhere in town, a tiny lamp above one of these holes would flicker awake, silently demanding the operator's immediate attention. Your job was to spot that light, grab the correct cords, and connect two people, all within a matter of seconds, without showing any sign of effort or stress. The account calls it a slot machine, a loom, and a panic attack, fused into one beautiful oak cabinet. It was a complex, high-pressure environment.
A panic attack in an oak cabinet. That's a perfect encapsulation. Tell me more about the physical components, the holes, the cords, how they functioned.
Up close, it was genuinely intimidating. Each hole was called a jack, and it was wired directly to a specific telephone line somewhere out in the world. There were hundreds of them, often rising just beyond arm's reach. Below them were the cords, arranged in pairs, with each pair able to bridge two jacks together. The core of the job was learning which jack corresponded to which line and executing the connection with incredible speed and accuracy. It's like being handed a piano with 300 keys and being told someone's entire evening depends on hitting precisely the right one under immense time pressure.
The cords themselves seem to have had a personality, almost. The account says they were not pleasant.
They were definitely characters unto themselves. They were weighted at the base, designed to snap back into place once you were done with them, which sounds helpful in theory. But in practice, one might recoil at exactly the wrong moment, causing tangles or mishaps. They'd tangle, they'd stick, and after hours of constant use, they would grow uncomfortably warm under your fingers. Operators learned to handle them almost instinctively, with the practiced dexterity of a card dealer shuffling a deck. Quick, sure, sliding a plug home without even needing to look down. A new operator would inevitably fumble, but a seasoned one would barely glance at her hands. That gap represented months of aching repetition and training.
And then there are the lights, the constant blinking taskmasters. They're signaling constantly, demanding attention.
Those lights were the very heartbeat of the board. Someone lifts a receiver, a lamp glows, an urgent signal indicating a call. You connect them and another light confirms the call is live. When they hang up, the light changes again, telling you it's time to pull the cord and free the line. During a busy period, the entire board could light up like a frantic Christmas display, and every single bulb represented a person demanding something right now. There was absolutely no pause button, no opportunity to catch your breath, just the next light, endlessly, perpetually demanding attention.
The auditory landscape must have been just as unique, a constant hum of activity.
It had its own strange music, the soft, rhythmic clatter of plugs being inserted and removed, the constant murmur of dozens of operators, each saying "number please" simultaneously, creating a kind of background hum that permeated the room, the faint buzz of the lines themselves, and the squeak of chairs as operators shifted, trying to alleviate the discomfort. It all blended into a low, pervasive hum that would follow them home, subtly ringing in their ears as they tried to fall asleep. Some nights, they'd even hear it in their dreams, a phantom switchboard, always demanding to be answered, even in their unconscious state.
So even after the shift ended, the job continued to echo in their minds. It's not just a physical toll, but a profound mental one. And this intense environment, this constant vigilance for hours on end.
Exactly. Even during quiet periods, a light could blink at any second, requiring immediate response. So you sat poised, hands near the cords, eyes constantly scanning the rows, literally a coiled spring in a neat blouse, ready for action. The machine didn't care if you were tired, it only cared that a light was glowing and needed answering. By the end of the first day, your fingers would ache, your eyes would be strained and perhaps crossed, and that wall of holes would haunt your vision, but you would have survived. The next crucial step was learning to speak its language, starting with those two defining words.
Number, please. That sounds deceptively simple, yet this account implies it was a deeply complex, almost theatrical performance.
It was anything but simple. Every single call began with those two words, spoken in a tone so warm, and even it was said it could soothe a screaming baby or a furious banker. Operators were absolutely forbidden from sounding tired, bored, annoyed, or, critically, human in their delivery. You had to deliver it with the same flawless, serene composure at 8 in the morning as you did at the end of a grueling 9-hour shift, even when you felt your soul had left your body and was floating somewhere near the ceiling fan, completely detached.
So the company had incredibly strict rules about vocal delivery. This wasn't just about being polite, it was about absolute, unwavering emotional control and consistency.
Unwavering emotional control was paramount. The company had precise guidelines on how fast you spoke, how friendly you sounded. You could never, ever let your real feelings leak into your voice. You were expected to be a customer service angel, and that halo was mandatory, an intrinsic part of the role. The phrase "number, please" became less a question and more a reflex, a pure tone, a little melody you could produce on command, regardless of your inner state. It's like repeating your own name so many times it loses all personal meaning, becoming just a sound.
That level of discipline must have been exhausting to maintain that facade for so long, day after day.
The discipline was almost military in its rigidity. There was a correct, prescribed way to handle nearly every conceivable situation. A confused caller? Guide them gently. A rude caller? Stay sweet, no matter how provocative. Someone shouting down the line? You had to absorb it like a pillow absorbs a fist. Calm, soft, and utterly unbothered. Your voice was the company's most important product, and a single sharp note, a hint of irritation, could result in a mark against your record. Imagine trying to remain perfectly polite to someone screaming about their phone bill, all while a supervisor silently scribbles notes about your tone just a few feet away. That was just Tuesday for many operators.
It's a profound psychological demand to essentially become a disembodied voice without any personal personality, entirely by design.
Exactly. You didn't chat. You didn't editorialize. A caller might share something scandalous, fascinating, or heartbreaking, and your only permitted response was a calm, neutral phrase that gave nothing away. You were a voice deliberately stripped of its own personality. Maintaining a single emotional register for 9 hours is an exhausting feat in a way that's genuinely hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. Your real feelings didn't vanish. They just had nowhere to go, no outlet. You could be furious, grieving, or giddy with good news, and absolutely none of it could touch your voice. It had to remain perfectly even.
So they were constantly splitting themselves in two, the serene, unflappable operator and the actual human being trapped quietly behind her, experiencing life. It sounds like a deeply dissociative experience.
Precisely. Reconciling those two halves at the end of a shift required real, conscious effort. That phrase, "number, please," became so deeply ingrained that operators might murmur it in their sleep or almost say it to their own mother at dinner, a complete reflex. 2 small words, the opening note of every tiny drama that crossed their board. They'd mastered the sound of the job. But then, as you alluded to earlier, there was also the visual aspect. Even if no one saw them, they had to look the part impeccably.
Dressed for an audience of no one. That's the perfect paradox, isn't it? They were polished and presented for an audience that would literally never see them, only hear them.
It truly is. The uniform was precise, a pressed blouse, tidy hair, a modest skirt, sensible shoes. The underlying logic was that a tidy operator was a disciplined operator, and discipline, in turn, meant fewer mistakes. So they dressed for an audience over a wire, as this account states. It's like getting fully done up just to record a voicemail today, but with significantly higher stakes for one's job.
And the company genuinely believed this connection between outward appearance and job performance?
Absolutely. They thought the woman who slouched in a wrinkled blouse was inherently the same woman who'd plugged the wrong cord into the mayor's private line, creating a social or political disaster. The standards were rigorous: hair pinned neatly back, clothes clean and pressed, nails checked, shoes checked for scuffs. In some offices, a supervisor would inspect the rows each morning, much like a sergeant reviewing troops, except these troops were armed with brass plugs and impeccable diction, not firearms.
There must have been a deeper psychological reason for this beyond just avoiding technical mistakes. It seems to be about maintaining a certain image of the company.
There was. It was all about respectability, projecting an image of unwavering reliability and trustworthiness. The telephone company was in essence selling trust. People were handing over their secrets, their emergencies, their most intimate moments to invisible women they'd never meet. The company needed those women to feel utterly unimpeachable beyond reproach. Dressing the part, in their view, had a funny way of making you act the part. Sit up straight in a crisp blouse, and you feel professional. Slouch in something rumpled, and the whole performance sags, perhaps impacting internal discipline.
The irony is striking. 9 hours, immaculately presented, for strangers who would literally never see your face. They were always on stage, even when the audience wasn't physically present.
And the men on the other end of the line might picture a glamorous starlet or a kindly grandmother, and the operator would never correct that image because they'd never know what she looked like. They were, in a poetic sense, a beautifully wrapped gift no one would ever open, polished daily for the sheer principle of the thing, for the internal ideal. And every morning as they settled into their seats, freshly pressed and perfectly poised, there was this lingering chill on the back of their necks, because someone was always watching.
That someone was, of course, the supervisor, the watchful, ever-present eye that maintained these impossible standards. That must have been a unique kind of pressure.
Exactly. The supervisor patrolled the rows like a hawk in sensible heels. Their job was to listen in on calls, time responses, and note every perceived flaw on a small card, a permanent record. Half a second slow on a greeting? Noted. A sharp edge in your voice with a rude caller? Also noted. There was no chatting, no daydreaming, no relaxing. You were constantly being measured by the second, and those measurements never stopped, creating a relentless environment.
And often these supervisors were former operators themselves. Did that make them more understanding, or perhaps more severe, because they knew all the tricks?
It often made them more merciless. They knew every shortcut, every subtle way to bend the rules, because they had tried them all themselves during their own time on the board. Their primary weapon was silent listening. At any moment, without warning, a supervisor could plug into your line and hear exactly what you were doing. The insidious part was the uncertainty. You never knew when they might be listening. This meant you had to perform flawlessly every second, because the moment you relaxed might be precisely the moment she was there, observing.
So it created this pervasive, low-grade dread, not necessarily overt abuse or yelling, but constant surveillance under impossible standards that were difficult to meet.
That's right. Comfort was viewed with suspicion. Stillness was virtue. That kind of pressure didn't explode in dramatic fashion. It seeped into your body, settling into your shoulders, staying there, a constant tension. Imagine someone reading over your shoulder while you're typing, but stretching that feeling across an entire career, knowing every keystroke is being judged.
And yet, this account also suggests these supervisors weren't necessarily villains. They were part of the same system.
They weren't, not really. They were caught in the same systemic machine, pressured from above by company mandates, and simply passed that pressure down because it had nowhere else to go. While some were undoubtedly cruel and took pleasure in their authority, many were simply tired women performing a difficult job, enforcing rules they hadn't written themselves. But there was one aspect of the job that no supervisor could ever grade, a feat performed entirely within the operator's own mind, invisible to anyone else.
The human directory, the idea that you had to memorize an entire town's connections. How extensive was this mental map of the community?
In a small town, you weren't just connecting numbers, you knew them. You knew the Hendersons shared a party line with the Caldwells. You knew Dr. Pwitt took calls at all hours. People would simply call and say, "Get me the church," or "Ring my sister," and you would know exactly who they meant and precisely which jack to plug into. You were the original autocomplete, long before computers, running on coffee and perhaps a healthy dose of sheer dread about making a mistake.
Without screens or search bars, this was an incredible feat of memory and a deep, ingrained understanding of the community.
It truly was. There were printed lists for reference, of course, but your own memory quickly became the primary database, absorbing the town's intricate connections like a sponge. After just a few months, operators carried hundreds of names and numbers in their heads, cross-referenced and ready for instant recall. And it wasn't just numbers. They learned the rhythms of the place, which businesses were busy in the morning, which lawyer never answered his phone, who called whom, and even roughly why, inferring from the patterns.
So they weren't just connecting lines, they were navigating a living social map of the town in real time.
A map they had memorized without ever intending to. Walking down the street on their day off, they didn't just see neighbors, they saw nodes in a network only they could fully picture, understanding the invisible connections. It created a strange, intimate, yet profoundly lonely way of knowing their hometown, privy to all its comings and goings. But this very memorization, this deep understanding of the town's connections, led directly into another very peculiar feature of 1950s phone life.
The party line. This is something that seems completely alien to us today, where everyone expects perfect privacy on a call and indeed has it.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? Many homes simply didn't have a private line. Instead, several households, sometimes as many as 8 or 10, would share a single wire. This meant that when you connected a call, half the neighborhood could quietly lift their receivers and listen in. Privacy was, quite literally, just a rumor, an aspirational concept, rather than a guarantee.
So if you were on a call, you had no idea if others were listening. That must have led to some awkward situations.
Well, families developed special ring patterns to distinguish their calls, 2 short rings for the Millers, 1 long for the Days, for example. So you'd know if a call was intended for your household, but anyone on that shared line could still pick up, silently joining the conversation. And you, the operator, were at the absolute center of this tangled web, the one person who could see precisely who was talking to whom and who was listening in.
The reason for the party line was purely economic, I assume, to cut costs wherever possible.
Entirely. Running a separate wire to every home was incredibly expensive, especially in rural or less affluent areas. So the phone company would string one line and split the cost among multiple households. Imagine if your phone calls today were technically a group chat that anyone on your street could silently join with no warning. The ring patterns were ingenious, a kind of Morse code for the kitchen wall, allowing 10 homes to share one line without complete chaos or endless interruptions.
But it also made eavesdropping incredibly easy. Did operators notice this happening often, people just listening in?
Oh, absolutely. Operators would hear the soft click of extra listeners joining a call, the faint breathing of neighbors who absolutely should not have been there, but were. People adapted to this inherent lack of privacy. They learned to hint rather than state, to save truly private conversations for face-to-face interactions, not over the phone. From the operator's seat, the entire social structure of the town's gossip was laid bare. who shared a line with whom, who called constantly, who never called at all. They knew the architecture of the town's gossip before the gossip even happened, watching it unfold in real time.
And that leads us to the inevitable question, what you could hear. The elephant on the switchboard, as this account puts it. Operators could hear everything, or at least a great deal.
They truly could. To connect a call, an operator sometimes had to remain on the line for a moment to confirm it went through properly. To disconnect, they had to check if the parties were still talking, to avoid cutting off an active conversation. In those small windows, voices poured into their headset, raw and unguarded, because no one truly believed anyone else was there, actively listening. The rules were strict against lingering, but operators were human beings with ears, and the temptation was always humming quietly, just like the lines themselves, an ever-present hum of potential information.
So, while strict rules were in place, the opportunity, and perhaps the temptation, to listen a second longer was constant.
It was an internal battle. Most operators, of course, resisted, but some didn't, and all of them, without exception, heard far more than they ever let on, more than they were ever allowed to reveal. People spoke on the phone as if they were entirely alone. As far as they knew, they were. In those few seconds, an operator would catch them at their most unguarded, just before they remembered to perform for the world. It was like accidentally reading a single sentence of someone's diary, repeated over and over, all day long, a glimpse into their private thoughts.
And the rule was ironclad. Never linger, never eavesdrop, never breathe a word of anything overheard. The consequences must have been severe for breaking that.
Absolutely ironclad. The secrecy of communication was sacred, drilled into them from day one, enforced with the threat of instant dismissal. A town would simply not entrust its life to a wire if it suspected the wire had a wagging tongue, that their private conversations would become public knowledge. So most operators held the line, literally and figuratively, with immense self-discipline. But that temptation was always there. A voice trembling on the edge of something, an argument cresting, the cord already in your hand. You'd think, one more second wouldn't hurt. No one would ever know.
But some inevitably gave in despite the risks.
A few did, and they risked everything. An operator caught listening was an operator with no future. Their career immediately terminated. So they heard these unguarded voices, said nothing, and pulled the cord, disconnecting. And some of what they heard, they carried quietly for the rest of their lives. Especially the secrets people were most desperate to keep, the ones that could unravel lives if revealed.
Which brings us to secrets of the heart. The truly personal stuff, the illicit affairs, the hidden relationships. It's a heavy burden to carry.
The truly intimate details indeed. Operators learned, often without even trying, which married man called a certain woman every Thursday when his wife was conveniently visiting her mother. They'd hear the careful, soft voices of people who believed that distance and a telephone made them invisible, safe from prying eyes. They'd connect the calls, say nothing, and then maintain a perfectly blank, neutral face when passing those very same people on the street the next morning, as if nothing had transpired.
The patterns must have been a dead giveaway. The repetition of certain numbers at certain times.
They were. The same two numbers connecting at the same odd hours week after week. An operator would notice a particular softness in a voice that didn't belong in an ordinary business call, for instance, and she'd know in the quiet, almost telepathic way she knew most things, exactly what kind of call it was. The strangeness came from the profound contrast between what they knew from the wire and what they observed on the street. The very man whose clandestine calls you connected would tip his hat to you at the grocer's, polite and ordinary, his secret seemingly tucked safely behind his smile. He had no idea you knew everything.
It's like knowing the plot twist of a play while the actor performs the first act, completely certain he's fooling everyone. That's a powerful analogy for their unique perspective.
A perfect analogy. Operators became remarkably skilled at maintaining that blank face. It was a necessary survival skill for the job. and the temptation to share this juicy information must have been enormous because the stakes were total. A gossiping operator didn't just lose her job, she effectively destroyed the entire foundation of the profession's trust, eroding the company's credibility within the community.
There's a profound loneliness embedded in that role then, knowing so much but being unable to share any of it.
A very particular kind of loneliness. You knew the truest, rawest things about your neighbors, and you could never acknowledge a single word of it, never offer advice or comfort. You couldn't warn the wife. You couldn't comfort the heartbroken. You held the town's most intimate truths in one hand and a vow of total silence in the other, balancing it every single day. But not every secret was about romance or relationships. Some were about something even more fundamental in a small town: money.
Secrets in suits. In a small town, money can be even more private and sensitive than affairs, with far-reaching consequences.
It often was, yes. Operators overheard businessmen arranging deals, farmers begging the bank for one more month's extension, families quietly discussing what they could and couldn't afford. You'd know which shop was about to fold before its owner even admitted it to himself or his family. In a small town, everyone's finances were technically secret, yet practically an open question, and all that money talk, often in hushed, lowered voices, went straight through you, the unseen listener.
So they were, in effect, economic forecasters who never published a word, with an unparalleled understanding of the town's financial health.
Exactly. A flurry of calls to the bank from a struggling business, a farmer's voice cracking as he asked for more time, his livelihood on the line, a shopkeeper's forced brightness with a creditor when the operator had already heard 3 other calls indicating things weren't fine at all. If they had been a different sort of person, with different ethics, that knowledge alone could have made them rich through insider trading. Instead, they connected the cord, kept their mouths shut, and went home to their modest wage, the underpaid keeper of everyone else's fortune.
It's a peculiar position, this deep insight into prosperity and desperation without any personal gain. The desperation must have been particularly difficult to hear.
It is. The desperation was often the hardest part to hear. A father asking for more time on a loan, knowing his family's entire future rode on the answer, a desperate plea. Some of those voices stayed with them long after the cord was pulled. A whisper that a business was failing could often finish it off, sealing its fate. A rumor that a family was broke could shut every door in town to them, financially and socially. So operators guarded these money secrets as fiercely as any other. Their silence wasn't just professional, it was quietly a profound act of mercy, protecting livelihoods.
That's a powerful way to frame it. But beyond the financial and personal secrets, there were also the calls that stayed with you, the truly heavy, life-altering ones delivered through them.
These were the calls that sat in your chest for years, long after the shift ended. You'd connect the doctor to a family in the middle of the night. You'd place the call that delivered news to a mother that her son wasn't coming home from war or an accident. You'd hear the silence after that news landed, the kind of silence that has immense weight, that fills a room and absorbs all sound. You couldn't offer comfort. You couldn't say a single word of condolence. You simply pulled the cord when it was over and moved on to the next blinking light, carrying that raw grief quietly into the rest of your shift, internalizing it.
The town never saw them cry, but they must have. The emotional impact of being the conduit for such devastating news.
They did. Sometimes in the break room between calls, finding a brief moment of privacy to release the pressure. A telephone in the 1950s carried the worst news a family could receive, and it carried it through the operator, making her an unwilling participant. They didn't choose these calls. They arrived like all the others, a small light among dozens, giving no warning of the immense emotional weight it held. Every instinct might scream to offer comfort, to intervene, but their role strictly forbade it. They were merely the connection, not a participant in the drama. The kindest thing they could offer was their absence, their professional distance to allow the family their private moment.
And they had no time to process this. The board didn't pause for grief. The calls just kept coming.
Not at all. You just heard a family's heart break. experienced that profound moment, and 3 seconds later you were saying, "Number, please," to someone calling about a grocery delivery or a dry cleaner. They learned to fold these heavy things away incredibly fast because the unrelenting work demanded it. And yet they came back the next day, ready to be that steady, calm voice in the dark when it was needed. There was a quiet dignity in that, a profound strength, but not all calls carried grief. Some felt almost magical in their ability to bridge distances.
Long-distance calling. Before direct dialing, this must have been a monumental task, connecting people across vast distances.
It was an incredibly intricate dance, a complex manual process. Calling another city wasn't as simple as dialing. It always went through the operator. You'd plug into what were called trunk lines, coordinating with operators in other towns, and then stitch together a conversation across hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles. It was like a carefully choreographed switchboard relay race across the country. People only made long-distance calls for the biggest, most important reasons: weddings, deaths, soldiers reaching home from overseas, urgent emergencies. So, when that light blinked for a long-distance call, you knew something truly significant and often life-altering was happening somewhere.
So, for a few crackling minutes, these operators made a vast country feel small, a tangible connection across distances that once felt impossible.
Exactly. The coordination required real, sophisticated skill, tracking which trunk lines were free, relaying numbers and instructions to distant operators. Managing the timing and connections as a fragile connection was built piece by piece across multiple points, often with static and delay. It was less like flipping a simple switch and more like conducting a small, scattered orchestra you couldn't see, ensuring every instrument played in tune. And it cost a fortune, which further reinforced its importance. You weren't connecting idle chatter across the miles, you were connecting the milestones of people's lives, their most significant moments.
And from their seat in one small town, they touched a web stretching across the entire nation, connecting individuals through this complex network.
Operator to operator, all the way to the coast and back again. It made their dim little room feel briefly, thrillingly large, connected to something immense. But whether long distance or local, whether magical or routine, every single call extracted a physical toll. Because while their voice had to stay light and unbothered, their body was quietly paying the bill for every hour they sat at that board, performing this demanding work.
What the job did to your body. We've touched on the mental strain and emotional burden, but the physical demands often get overlooked for seemingly sedentary jobs like this.
They do. It's easily underestimated. Their headset was heavy, pressing into their skull until they could literally feel their own heartbeat throbbing in their ear, a constant dull ache. Their arms would ache from reaching across the massive board hundreds of times an hour, making repetitive motions. Their backs rebelled against the rigid posture they were required to hold for extended periods. By the end of a shift, their neck was stiff, fingers sore, their jaw aching from smiling into a wire that couldn't see them, but where the smile was still deemed essential. From the outside, the job looked gentle, effortless even. Their body, however, knew the painful truth of the constant strain.
And the constant input into one ear from the headset, all those voices, all that noise for hours on end.
Some operators developed real hearing strain from the constant pressure and the endless stream of voices funneled into a single ear. Imagine wearing a heavy clamp on your head for 9 hours while 100 strangers talk directly into it, without a break. Then there was the reaching, hundreds of times an hour, the same repetitive motion, a quiet, grinding ache building slowly through the shift and following them home. This was repetitive strain injury, long before anyone even had a name for it or understood its long-term effects.
And the posture, the forced uprightness and immobility for hours, that alone can be agonizing.
That was its own slow torment. Holding a rigid position for hours on end does something profoundly uncomfortable to a body that no one warns you about beforehand, and even their voice, the very tool of their trade, took a beating too. By the end of the day, their throat ached, their jaw sore from maintaining the steady, perfectly enunciated diction they were required to uphold. The warmth callers heard, that professional serenity, cost them something very real to produce, physically.
The description mentions the strangest ache of all was the jaw, from smiling at no one. That's such a poignant detail, capturing the performative aspect.
It's such a poignant detail, isn't it? Because the company genuinely believed a smile could be heard in the voice, and in a subtle psychological way, they weren't entirely wrong. All of this added up to a job that looked effortless and gentle from the outside, but felt grueling and intensely physically demanding on the inside. No heavy lifting, no visible danger, but their bodies knew the profound difference between looking gentle and actually being gentle. And as if the physical strain weren't enough, the job found one more small, undignified way to test their limits.
The rationed bathroom break. That's a stark reminder of the lack of autonomy, even over basic bodily functions.
A deeply frustrating and undignified one. You couldn't just stand up and leave your post. The board never stopped blinking with new calls, and someone always had to cover your position. So breaks were strictly scheduled, closely supervised, and precisely timed. Woe to the woman who took even a moment too long. Operators learned to drink very little water during their shifts, a quiet, personal strategy to avoid the humiliating dance of asking permission to be human to use the facilities.
Running an entire town's communications while negotiating with your own bladder like a hostile foreign power. That's a powerful image of indignity.
It truly encapsulates it. Leaving your position was a logistical event, dictated by the board's demands and staffing, not a personal decision based on need. If the board was busy, your break might be pushed back indefinitely. If you lingered even a moment too long, it was noted, a mark against your record. The most basic bodily function in the world had become a scheduled, faintly humiliating transaction. The indignity, perhaps, stung more than the discomfort itself, eroding a sense of personal worth.
So you could be the calm voice saving a life one minute and a grown woman quietly hoping her scheduled break came soon the next. It's a jarring contrast.
Exactly. The job demanded immense responsibility, often life or death decision-making, yet granted startlingly little personal autonomy. Yet, as with everything else, they adapted. One carefully rationed sip of water at a time. But not every duty was a hardship. Some aspects of the job were almost tender, providing a different kind of human connection.
The gentle duties. It sounds like a welcome counterpoint to all the pressure, the secrecy, and the physical strain we've been discussing.
They were. People would call simply to ask the time, and operators would tell them, warm and certain, like a clock with a heartbeat, a reliable, comforting voice. Others would arrange wake-up calls, trusting the operator to ring at precisely 5 in the morning so they wouldn't miss a train, a critical work shift, or a bus to the city. Operators in these moments became the quiet caretakers of the town's daily rhythm, a fundamental part of its functioning.
In an era before everyone owned a reliable clock or had alarm clocks, they were essentially a living timepiece, an essential service.
Yes, and the wake-up calls specifically highlighted a deep level of trust placed in these unseen women. A man who absolutely couldn't afford to oversleep would go to bed trusting a stranger he'd never met to wake him at exactly the right hour, with no margin for error. Forgetting wasn't a small slip. It could mean a missed train, a lost shift, a docked wage, serious consequences. So they remembered. They watched the clock. And when the hour came, they'd ring the line and gently coax a stranger out of sleep, providing a vital service.
There's something very tender in being the one who wakes a town, who initiates its day.
It's a quiet, foundational role, the soft alarm for the bakers and the laborers and the commuters, the very people the world depended on to function. These callers rarely thanked them properly, in person. Their mornings simply began with the operator's voice, a seamless transition. These gentle duties provided a necessary emotional balance to the heavier, more stressful parts of the job. But not all duties were gentle nudges. Sometimes the blinking light carried genuine, urgent panic.
When you were the whole emergency system. Today we dial 911, and that's an established, specialized service. What did people do in the 1950s when there was no such number?
There was no dedicated emergency number. If a house caught fire, if a child stopped breathing, if a man clutched his chest at midnight, people called the operator. In that instant, she stopped being a mere operator and became the town's entire emergency system, the singular point of contact. She'd connect them to the doctor, the fire brigade, the police, all while simultaneously trying to keep a panicking caller calm, with nothing but her perfectly modulated voice and steady demeanor.
So lives genuinely depended on how fast her hands moved and how steady her voice stayed, her ability to maintain control in chaos.
Absolutely. A terrified person isn't easy to understand. They babble, they panic, they often forget crucial details like their address, so the operator had to steady them, extract the critical information, and dispatch aid, often all in the same breath, with no script, no formalized training for crisis management, and no time to prepare. What's truly remarkable is how often these women rose to such occasions with absolutely no formal crisis training. They were hired for their voices, not their nerves under fire. Yet when the emergency came, they performed admirably.
And then, just as quickly, it was over. No time to reflect on what they'd just done.
The cord was pulled and the next light was already blinking, demanding attention. You just helped save a life, or desperately tried to. And now someone wanted the hardware store, completely oblivious to the preceding drama. No applause, no acknowledgement, just the next call, endlessly. That was the job. And for all of it, all that skill, all that responsibility, all that grace under pressure, the profound impact they had, the company paid them a wage that would make you laugh if it didn't make you sigh first.
The thin paycheck. It seems like a cruel irony given all we've discussed about their indispensable, often life-saving role within the community.
It is. Consider their actual duties. Holding the town's communications together, memorizing hundreds of connections, keeping its deepest secrets, waking its workers, serving as its de facto emergency response system. By any honest measure, they were essential infrastructure, the backbone of a community. Their paycheck, however, suggested otherwise, almost dismissively.
And the logic behind the significant discrepancy between their value and their compensation.
The logic was simple and profoundly cynical. Young, unmarried women had very few truly respectable career alternatives available to them at the time, and the phone company knew this implicitly. They paid what they could get away with, secure in the knowledge that these women had nowhere else to go that offered similar respectability and social standing. The word respectable did a lot of heavy lifting, making them feel grateful for the privilege of the position itself, rather than demanding fair wages. Gratitude, it turned out, was significantly cheaper than fair wages, and the company spent it freely as a form of non-monetary compensation.
So they were immersed in the financial lives of the town's wealthier citizens, handling their transactions, understanding their fortunes, yet went home to a meager, modest wage.
A stark and often painful contrast. They understood the flow of money better than most, having spent their days immersed in the details of riches that would never be their own. There's a quiet injustice there, a workforce of highly skilled, irreplaceable women, literally holding a community together, yet underpaid precisely because their options were so limited by societal norms. But thin wages weren't the only way the job kept them firmly in their place.
The marriage bar. This is another aspect that feels so antiquated now, the idea that getting married could cost you your job, despite all your skill and dedication.
It's difficult to imagine today, but in many places it was standard company policy. Companies explicitly preferred their operators to be young and unmarried, believing a wife belonged at home, focused on domestic duties. So operators would watch colleagues quietly hide their engagement rings or simply leave the company entirely once they wed, often with heavy hearts. Their career and their personal life were set on a collision course from day one, and everyone knew which one was expected to win that conflict.
It meant there was no real path to a long-term career for these women, no opportunity to grow old at the switchboard.
None at all. Some women tried to hide their engagements, some married in private, hoping no one noticed for a while longer. Others simply worked until the wedding day, then walked away from the board for good, their service abruptly ending. You watched colleagues you had trained beside vanish from the rows, one by one, as their personal lives moved forward and their jobs fell away. There was no growing old at the switchboard, no long-term professional trajectory. The job was always intended to be a chapter, not a lifetime, and the company wrote the ending in advance, quite literally.
So living under that rule quietly shaped everything. You measured your time at the board against the rest of your life, knowing it was temporary.
Knowing one would eventually have to give way to the other. And under all of it ran the constant grinding pressure to be perfect, because the rules left absolutely no room for error, even for minor slips. Nothing demonstrated that brutal reality more clearly than a single wrong cord connection.
Mistakes were instant and public. Today we have undo buttons, revision histories, and ample time to correct errors before anyone notices. This sounds much more unforgiving, with immediate, undeniable consequences.
Immeasurably more unforgiving. Plug a cord into the wrong hole, and you've instantly connected two strangers mid-sentence, or cut off the mayor mid-rant during an important call, or dropped a long-distance call someone waited a week to make, potentially losing a crucial connection. There was no undo button, no apologetic email to smooth things over, just two confused voices on the line, and the supervisor's pen scratching against her card, meticulously documenting the error.
The immediacy of that public error, knowing you've created a problem that everyone can hear, must have been terrifying.
It was. There was no buffer, no draft mode, no opportunity to fix it privately. The error was live, happening in real time, directly in someone's ear, impacting their conversation. And every single mistake was recorded, another mark in a profession already thick with marks and expectations. This bred a particular kind of sustained tension. You had to be incredibly fast because the board never waited for you, but you also had to be utterly flawless because every slip was instant, immediately noticeable, and permanently remembered.
Most jobs allow you to trade speed for accuracy or vice versa, depending on the situation. This job demanded both simultaneously with constant observation.
This job demanded both. Always, with someone always watching, listening. Their hands moved quickly and surely from long repetition and deeply ingrained muscle memory, and yet underneath, there was often a faint tremble, the body's honest, involuntary response to relentless, high-stakes pressure. And, of course, their voice never betrayed any of it. That was the deeper performance, connecting a wrong chord, feeling the spike of panic, scrambling internally to fix it, all while your voice remained perfectly warm, even, and unbothered.
That relentless pressure, the impossible standards, could have crushed them. But it didn't. And the reason, as this account suggests, takes us off the board entirely, away from the machinery.
It takes us into the break room sisterhood. Amidst all that individual pressure, isolation, and constant surveillance, the operators formed their own quiet sisterhood, built on shared exhaustion, unspoken understanding, and mutual support. You couldn't gossip about callers, obviously, but you could share a look, a knowing sigh, a silent glance when a particular light blinked a certain way, conveying so much without words.
They covered each other's breaks, traded survival tips, creating a crucial support network.
Exactly. They learned who could be trusted on the really heavy days, who could step in for a moment of relief. The bond formed in the way it always does among people who share something inherently difficult, physically and emotionally demanding. Only the woman in the next seat truly knew the weight of the headset, the ache of the posture, the burden of the secrets you couldn't tell, the sheer exhaustion.
So they communicated in a private language of small signals, gestures that only they understood.
A raised eyebrow, a weary sigh, a look that said, "I heard that one too, and will never speak of it," an unspoken pact. The job in many ways cut them off from the town entirely, placing them in a unique, isolated position. Yet that very isolation drove them straight into the arms of the other operators, the only ones who could truly understand what they were going through. Together, they held the whole town together with cords and silence, invisible to everyone but each other, their silent strength a shared bond.
But the bustling camaraderie of a shared shift didn't last all day. When the town finally went to sleep, a very different kind of shift began, a quieter, stranger, and often lonelier one.
The night shift. The board barely blinked then. The room was dim, still, and almost eerily quiet compared to the daytime bustle, and the calls that did come were different. Lonelier, stranger, sadder, reflecting the vulnerability of the night. The insomniac who just wanted to hear a voice, any voice. The drunk man trying to reach a woman who stopped answering long ago. The frightened child whose parents weren't home, calling out into the dark.
So the operator became a singular, glowing window in a dark town, the only one awake and listening.
The one person awake and listening, the solitary connection. Daytime calls were practical, often mundane, reflecting the busy routines of life. Nighttime calls came from the people the daylight didn't reach, the sleepless, the troubled, the afraid, the vulnerable. By day, you were one of many, a faceless voice in a vast system. By night, you were singular, the lone keeper of the town's open line, its silent guardian.
That must have been profoundly tiring, being awake and vigilant while the rest of the world slept, especially absorbing those raw, vulnerable calls.
It was, and yet, oddly, it often felt like the most meaningful shift of all, a quiet vigil over the town, holding the line so that no one, not even at 3 in the morning, was entirely alone, completely cut off. And among those midnight voices were a special few, those who didn't really want a connection to someone else, but just wanted a connection to humanity.
The lonely callers? That's a poignant category, isn't it? People reaching out for pure human contact.
That's right. Some folks called just to hear a kind voice, a moment of warmth, the widow who asked the time twice a day, perhaps not truly needing to know, but needing to speak, the old man who lingered a moment too long before saying goodbye, reluctant to break the connection. Operators weren't supposed to chat, strictly speaking, but they came to recognize these gentle, solitary souls reaching out through the only line they had to the world.
A few warm words from an operator might have been the only human conversation they had all day, a lifeline.
It's a heavy realization, the profound impact of such a brief interaction. These were often people the world had quietly set aside, the elderly, the widowed, the isolated, those on the margins. The telephone was their one fragile thread to the rest of humanity, and the operator was the warm, steady voice at the other end. The rules said not to chat, but faced with a lonely voice wanting nothing more than a moment of warmth, operators found small ways to give it, a gentler tone, a goodbye that didn't rush them off the line quite so fast, a tiny extension of kindness.
Tiny mercies tucked into the cracks of the rules. They couldn't fix the loneliness, but they could offer a moment of being heard and acknowledged.
And sometimes that was everything to that person, and all of it, the secrets, the emergencies, the lonely voices, the constant emotional regulation, came back to the single hardest thing this job asked of them, the ultimate demand.
The impossible wait. Knowing everything about everyone and saying absolutely nothing ever, maintaining that perfect silence.
It's the core of the paradox, the essence of their burden. They signed on to secrecy and they meant it. They internalized that oath. But they were people full of opinions and feelings, walking through a town whose deepest truths they carried intimately in their memory. They knew who was cheating, who was broke, who was sick, who was lying, and they smiled and said good morning and kept it all locked away, every single detail.
It wasn't abstract knowledge. It was about specific people, their neighbors, faces they passed on the street, people they knew and interacted with day in and day out.
Every human instinct pushes us to share what we know, to warn, to comfort, to connect through the trading of information and shared experiences. They had to override that fundamental instinct constantly, 100 times a day, for years. That made them, in a strange way, both the most trusted and the most alone person in town, isolated by their knowledge. They couldn't go home and unburden themselves, couldn't even hint at what they knew. So the weight simply accumulated inside them, year after year.
A private archive of the town's truest self that would die with them, untold. It's a profound form of integrity that left no monument, only an absence of harm.
Exactly. A kind of integrity that left no monument, only an absence of harm, a silent protection. And yet, even as they held the line so faithfully, a quiet rival was coming for their job, one that would never need an oath of silence because it had no ears at all, no human capacity for secrets.
The dial telephone, the beginning of the end for the Hello Girls, rendering their unique human skills obsolete.
Town by town, the company began installing phones that allowed people to connect calls themselves without any operator intervention. No operator required. At first, it seemed harmless, just another modernization, a convenience. But the operators felt the chill of what it truly meant. Every dial installed was a cord they'd never plug again. A job quietly disappearing, dissolving into a spinning wheel of numbers, a mechanical process.
The machine could connect a call, but it couldn't know the town, or comfort the frightened, or carry a secret. It lacked all the essential human qualities of the operators.
But the company didn't seem to mind those losses. To the public, it was the exciting modern future arriving on the kitchen wall, a new convenience. To the operators, it was simply one fewer call that needed them, one less opportunity to connect. The dial didn't need to memorize the town. It didn't need a sweet voice, perfect posture, years of training and emotional discipline. It just needed someone to turn it, a simple mechanical action.
So everything that made them good at the job, all their unique human contributions, was rendered beside the point by the machine's efficiency.
Exactly. And yet the operators knew something the machine could never replace, even if the company chose not to count it in its ledgers. The dial couldn't know that "Get Me, Mother" meant the house on the county road. It couldn't stay calm while a panicked voice reported a fire. It couldn't soften its tone for a lonely widow or wake a worker gently at dawn. The machine connected wires. The operators connected people in a profoundly human way. The machine won not because it was better in every sense, but because it was cheaper.
And that, in the end, was enough to seal their fate. Which brings us to the fade. The boards went dark.
One by one, the boards went dark, literally and figuratively. The dial, and later the push button, swept the operators aside, and the town lost something it didn't quite notice losing: a living memory, a steady voice, a keeper of its secrets, a silent, empathic presence. The new system was faster, cheaper, tireless, and far more efficient on paper, but it never knew your name, never rang you awake with kindness, never stayed on the line a heartbeat longer to make sure you were all right, to offer a moment of human warmth.
The Hello Girls clocked out for the last time. A whole way of being connected simply ended quietly.
Just as all their best work had always been done, quietly, invisibly. The town gained immense convenience, undeniable efficiency, but it lost the living intelligence behind the wire, the voice that knew which herald they meant, that remembered a regular's loneliness, that carried their secrets and never told. By every figure on the company's ledger, the machine was an improvement, a technological leap forward. In that cold accounting, that was all that mattered.
So there was no grand farewell, no monument, no public recognition for their decades of indispensable service.
No, they simply finished their final shifts and went home, and the boards went dark behind them, unceremoniously. It was a fitting end, in a way, for women whose best work had always been invisible, unsung, and quietly transformative. But before any of this, before they ever reached the live board, there was the school behind the job.
This was not just learning to operate a machine, but learning an entire persona, an entire way of being, it seems, almost a complete reprogramming.
Far from a simple technical training for a mechanical task. Before they were ever allowed near a live call, they had to attend weeks of intensive schooling. It was part trade school for the technical skills, part finishing school for their demeanor, and part a gentle interrogation about whether they could truly keep their voice sweet under pressure, under duress, consistently.
So they drilled their diction until it became second nature, ingrained deeply.
Until the company phrases lost all meaning to them personally, becoming pure, automatic sound. They introduced the practice board slowly, almost like a dangerous animal, correcting every reach, every grip, every movement, until the motions were burned deep into their muscle memory. The goal was to work without conscious thought, because on the live board, thinking was a luxury they simply wouldn't have time for. Everything had to be instantaneous.
And they also tested their temperament, their emotional resilience under simulated pressure.
Instructors would quietly throw difficult scenarios at them, observing how they responded under duress, how well they bent without breaking. Some women simply couldn't hold the mask, couldn't maintain the unflappable demeanor required for 9 hours straight. The training gently weeded them out, identifying those who lacked the innate calm or emotional control. Not everyone was built to be serene for 9 hours straight. By the end, you weren't the same person who walked in. You had been thoroughly reshaped into an operator, ready to meet the messy reality of actual human beings and their complex calls.
And this demanding, quiet service extended even to the holidays. The town didn't stop needing telephones just because it was Christmas or New Year's.
If anything, they needed them more. Families reaching across miles, the long-distance lines lighting up like the festive decorations everyone else was admiring. Someone had to sit at that board while the rest of the world gathered around their tables, celebrating. And that someone was often the operator, sacrificing their own holiday.
The work must have been both profoundly joyful, connecting families, and deeply relentless, knowing what you were missing.
It was. You'd connect calls full of laughter, soldiers reaching home, grandparents talking to grandchildren they rarely saw, all beautiful, heartwarming moments, and yet you sat apart from any of it, serving the very celebrations you were personally missing out on. There were small mercies among the operators. The break room might be a little warmer. The sisterhood felt a little closer and more supportive on those specific days, a shared understanding of their sacrifice.
And a quiet pride amidst the loneliness, knowing they were enabling these important connections.
A definite quiet pride. Every joyful call they connected happened because they had shown up, faithfully, on a day they had sacrificed their own celebrations. But not every caller who reached them on those long days was full of holiday cheer, or even genuine in their intentions.
Of course, there were pranksters, cranks, and silent callers. The less glamorous, often frustrating side of connecting the world, where their patience was truly tested.
For every legitimate connection, there was indeed the occasional caller who seemed to lift the receiver purely to make the operator's day stranger, or more difficult. Bored children calling just to giggle and hang up, finding amusement in the system. Bored adults, which was often far worse, sometimes malicious. Cranks who phoned just to vent their bad mood at the only person obligated to listen to them. The operator simply absorbed it all, unperturbed.
A man could rage about his phone bill, and the operator's only permitted response was calm, helpful, and completely unruffled. That's an extraordinary level of self-control.
Precisely, the trick was never letting them get a reaction, never showing any crack in the facade. You presented a wall of pleasant professionalism, a serene indifference, and most of these callers gave up when they realized they couldn't crack it, couldn't provoke a response. Then there were the truly unsettling ones, callers who said nothing at all, just a lifted receiver, held silence, the faint sound of breathing on the line. You'd repeat your greeting, wait, and eventually disconnect, a small, unexplained chill settling over you.
And through all of this, the unwavering, unbothered voice was the armor, their primary defense.
Their sweetness was their armor, protecting them from the slings and arrows of angry or malicious callers. But not every caller who grew attached to that voice was trying to bother them. Some were simply seeking comfort.
The accidental admirers. That's a unique and rather poignant byproduct of their constant, unseen kindness, a testament to the power of the human voice.
It was. Some men heard that warmth so often, so consistently, that they convinced themselves they were in love with it, with the disembodied voice. He'd never met the operator, never seen her face, and yet somehow he was smitten with a woman who was really just doing her job, performing her role flawlessly. He'd call more often than strictly necessary, invent small needs or questions just to hear her answer, ask her name and her hours, trying to find a connection.
Some even grew bold enough to declare their feelings to a woman whose face they'd never seen, based solely on her voice.
To a woman whose face they'd never seen. It was flattering, in a strange way, a recognition of their profound impact, and awkward in a much larger one, because the connection was fundamentally imbalanced. Operators handled it with gentle, firm professionalism, kind, but never encouraging false hope, maintaining strict boundaries. There was something a little sad underneath the awkwardness, too. These were often lonely men reaching for connection through the one warm, consistent voice available to them. The operator couldn't be what they imagined, the idealized figure, but she understood why they imagined it, the yearning behind the calls.
And just when they thought they understood every shape the job could take, every human interaction, the weather would remind them that connecting calls was sometimes the critical difference between a town surviving the night and facing it blind, cut off.
When the storm hit, when the wind howled and the snow piled high or floods swept through, the telephone became the town's absolute lifeline, its crucial link to the outside world, and that lifeline ran directly through the operator. While everyone else huddled inside their homes, safe from the elements, she sat at the board, holding the fragile wires together with both hands, physically maintaining the connection.
The lines themselves must have been incredibly fragile then, vulnerable to the elements.
Battered by wind and ice, crackling and dropping connections constantly, making the job even harder. Operators worked even harder to keep even a thread of communication alive, nursing failing lines. The pressure to stay was enormous and often unspoken. The town needed them most precisely when conditions were at their worst, when travel was impossible. So operators stayed through blizzards and floods, sometimes even sleeping at the office for days because there was no one to relieve them, no way to get home.
And the calls that came through then must have carried even greater urgency and weight.
They mattered more than ever, a family cut off and frightened, a medical emergency made infinitely worse by impossible roads and delayed help. Operators stayed sweet and clear and capable, maintaining their professional calm even as the building shook around them, because the people on the other end had nothing else to hold on to, no other source of comfort or hope. The dial machines that would one day replace them couldn't have done this. They couldn't nurse a failing line back to life. Couldn't have chosen to stay when staying was hard, even dangerous. Only a person could do that. And on the worst nights, that person was the telephone operator, holding the line for an entire community.
It's an incredible testament to their resilience and commitment, truly embodying service. So this brings us to the last word, summarizing this extraordinary, largely invisible life and its lasting impact.
This was their life behind the wire, sitting upright for 9 hours in an itchy blouse, smiling into a headset at no one, while a supervisor meticulously counted every breath, every pause. They memorized an entire town inside their skull, woke strangers gently at dawn, became the entire emergency system whenever a light blinked with panic. They carried the affairs, the debts, the heartbreaks, and the secrets of everyone they passed on the street, and they never breathed a word of any of it, maintaining perfect discretion.
They were the calm voice in the storm, the keeper of the hours, the lonely glow in a sleeping town, and for all of it, paid almost nothing, and thanked even less by the public.
Yet they held the line anyway, performing their duties with unwavering dedication. So as we reach for our phones today, and a call connects itself in an instant, no waiting, no wire, no woman in a dim room making it happen, perhaps we can spare a quiet thought for the hello girls, the ones who knew everything and said nothing, the ones who held a town's heart in their hands and set it down so gently no one noticed their profound, quiet labor.
Because history isn't only kings and battles, grand narratives and famous figures.
Sometimes it's a tired young woman, listening in the dark, making sure that no one, not even at 3 in the morning, was ever truly alone. This fascinating account, The Hello Girls, A Night with a 1950s Telephone Operator, offers us a remarkable glimpse into a forgotten world. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might appreciate hearing about this unique piece of history.